Hello, welcome to another edition of the Ducks Confidential Podcast. As always, I'm James Krupke, joined by Ryan Clark. And now that games are upon us, Ryan, we will definitely be getting into the results. Look ahead to next week's game between Oregon and Boise State. But a tradition unlike any other in the sports, particularly in college sports. It is truly amazing. I will say that you can pretty much set a clock to it. One fan base or another. And really most fan bases in college sports, to be honest. You go from somewhere around January, usually around February, because of signing day, now that it's even late signing day, to right near September 1st, depending on the calendar and the way the year falls. Hope springs eternal like none other. Everybody's going to go undefeated. Their team is the greatest they've ever seen. Nothing is wrong whatsoever. And then the tradition kicks in where even with great success, you can find misery. And when it isn't exactly amazing and perfect, and heaven forbid it be a rough performance as Oregon had against Idaho, oh my goodness, now the pessimism comes out like none other. So the last 7-8 months, no, let's not even go there. Let's not even... Never happened. Never happened. You have no reason for belief whatsoever. Yeah. Now it is just absolute, abject failure. Nothing but pessimism. Will this team even win another game? Even though they won. Can't be... No. There's no joy in winning when it is as ugly as 24-14 was. Now it is simply absolute, like I say, really misery. It is a tradition like any other in sport because truly, like I say, unless you are, I guess right now, unless you're Georgia, where you can go out, win a couple of national championships. All right, probably could have, would have, should have been a playoff team a year ago and open the season by just absolutely waxing a not very good Clemson team. Outside of them, I'm not sure very many people are happy today. Across college football, but especially this Oregon fan base has gone from, yes, great optimism for 7 or 8 months to just absolute misery, even in victory.
Yeah, I think that there's something woven into the DNA of Oregonians. Speaking as someone who grew up here, who's lived his whole life here, save for 4 years at Arizona State, the gap in feeling, in emotion. I don't know if it has to do with our weather, where we're never really satisfied. If it's hot, then people say it's too hot. I wish the rain would come back. If it's raining and cloudy, then people are like, God, I wish we had a longer summer, or our weather was a little more mild in the winter time. People, I think, are perpetually unsatisfied with things in this state at times, so maybe that's part of it.
Somewhere where they're not? Yes. Is there somewhere where they're... I guess Iowa, because Iowa, they had to be just perpetually okay with the Iowa offense for so long, and not playing anybody in non-conference play. But I guess them, I really...
Yeah. Yeah, no, if you're a Duck fan, I think I saw this on Reddit at this point, like, you can be glad that you're not Florida State right now. That's one thing. The other thing, of course, being, yes, this was disappointing. Yes, this was below the standard, as Dan Lanning outlined in his weekly presser yesterday. The offensive line play was brutal. Every phase of play for that offensive line was a struggle against Idaho, a team that they were expected to win by 50 against. So all that is true, but it also does not indicate, as you are pointing out, that the sky is falling and that the season is over for a Ducks team that remains one of the most talented and experienced in the country, not just in the Big Ten. They obviously got a lot to figure out. They can't have a game like that on Saturday against Boise State or they'll lose. But I don't think that the sky is falling. I think that there are more glaring issues, particularly on that offensive line, than perhaps any of us, including those of us in the media, thought. But by no means would it be impossible for Oregon to just come out and smack Boise State in the mouth on Saturday and then show everybody, like, okay, this is the team that we aspire to be.
Well, I mean, far be it from me, and this isn't about I told you so, because one, I'm not that pessimistic in general, or optimistic for that matter. I just call it what it is. But two, it's not about that. It's not trying to, rewrite history or go back and point out all the things you're right about or wrong about. It's just simply saying, gosh, if only somebody would have said something about the offensive line. I mean, what are we talking about here? I mean, we belabored the point quite a bit over the last couple of weeks in particular about the center position, and not just here and talking about it, but spent the better part of the offseason talking about the offensive line, talking about the center situation, because replacing the Remington Trophy winner was not going to be an easy task. And just assuming that everything was going to fall into place was, a little bit wide-eyed optimist. And what obviously really changed the dynamic in the conversation was when Bedford got hurt a couple of weeks ago. So, God, like I say, if only a couple of people had talked about it, if only anybody had mentioned that some of these things may have been a concern or a question mark. Yeah.
If only there was a podcast you could find that discussion. But in terms of the Bedford thing, like that obviously is part of it, but you could tell that, and Lanning even said this in terms of talking about how he didn't think Pickard was the guy that had a bad game. It was really like just a across the board issue. I mean, a guy like a Johnny Cornelius, who's a preseason All-American in a couple of outlets, had two just game breaking penalties on I think the same drive, and he was struggling, and it was an across the board issue. People had commented that the entire offensive line looked sluggish even from warm ups. The issues were ever present. I think from the beginning.
I could care less what's on message boards in the first place, but I just saw that because of the message board geniuses.
I'm not worried about it personally.
Whatever. That's again, everybody can so be it on that, but no. I mentioned the center spot because of the dominoes that then fall thereafter. No, I actually thought in real time that Pickard did just fine. And again, I don't know all the calls and what, I can't go through every protection he called or didn't or whatever. But bottom line, no, the issues that were had were not because of his play in terms of just blocking per se. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was pretty much an issue all across the board. I think with the exception of Marcus Harper, I think he might have been the only one, and Pickard, for that matter. I think those two didn't. Neither one of them had a penalty. And to my recollection, I don't believe Harper was the one who gave up the sack or anything. It was really two on the right side, where depending on who you want to pin the two on the right side on, whether it was Poncho and a Johnny or a Johnny on both or either which way. And then on the left side one, I'm trying to remember now. I think that was the one that kind of sprung loose where. They may have that might have been the chip block one. I'm trying to remember now. But bottom line, no, it was messy all around. 5 penalties in the offensive line. Each of them, you mentioned the 2 on Cornelius in particular. I mean, that just wipes out a touchdown. That's all it is. There's no doubt whatsoever that drive is going to end in a touchdown, and that takes points off the board. And all the others kill drives. Kill drives where they were going. So absolutely, there's no way around it. Oregon can absolutely sit there and say, hey, if not for all these penalties, again, an issue that if only we talked about it before. If only we talked about it, I don't know, all of last season with the offensive line. They completely covered up for the issue because of how efficient they were offensively last season. And it just completely overcame whether it was false starts, whether it was procedures, whether it was a legal man downfield. They completely covered that up, but there was undisciplined offensive line play in those, and some of those because of the man downfield stuff you just had to live with because of the situation with just the way the offense was. You had to kind of deal with it. But now, where you see it so glaringly against an inferior opponent, and it takes points off the board, and you see the absolute direct correlation so explicitly, and you can't overcome it against an inferior opponent, it makes it absolutely maddening. And that's where you come up to, and why I asked last night, of like, all right, is there not a point at which you got to say accountability has to include playing time? And I don't mean take him out of the starting lineup and never play a guy. Hey, you don't have to go way back in history here. It was only the preceding coach who, if there was a false start penalty at times, or holding in particular, an offensive lineman would come out of the game. I'm not talking about for dramatic periods of time. I'm not talking about rewriting the entire lineup. I'm talking about anything. There are plenty of places where that happens. You don't have to act like this is some foreign concept. This happened here only a couple of years ago. So there are, that is allowed. And what you basically got from Dan Lanning last night on that was, yeah, it's possible if the next guy was any good. That's basically what the response was. Yeah, you could do that if the next guy in line can also, hold up his end. And that's where things have got to, that's where the question has to start to lie now, as whenever Bedford gets back, whether it's this week, next week, and that was another question last night of, hey, fine, he gets back. Then what do you do? And we talked about this before. But it's not just about center, because, again, I'm not making anything about Charlie Pickard in a bad way at all. So then what do you do? Because is Poncho just going back to snapping? Because part of the issue of why he's not at center is the snapping. So now Bedford comes back, is Poncho snapping? Or is Charlie still at center? Or if it's Pickard, which, fine. So now you're saying, all right, Poncho not ahead of Charlie at the snapping situation. But he is ahead clearly at guard, even with a brutal day. So Nishad Strother, a 3-year starter at East Carolina, yes, in the AAC, but a 3-year starter who was competing for a starting job a year ago, separated his shoulder, came back. You brought in a transfer to replace Stephen Jones, and Bedford ultimately will once healthy. He is not better than a struggling sophomore today. And even when the chips start to fall and things start to arrange themselves accordingly, basically, like, where does he fit here?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that gets answered this week in terms of, I mean, not answered to us. Lord knows we're not gonna know until Saturday. But in terms of that answer and whether Strother can get in there and perhaps replace Poncho at that guard spot if Bedford's not available, that I think will get hashed out this week. But I honestly do think that Pickard's performance and Lanning going out of his way to say that Pickard wasn't the problem lends itself to him maybe being the guy going forward at center, especially with what you're talking about with Poncho and having to sort of improve in the snapping department, to his own admission. In terms of the game itself and looking back on the performance that was and the different combinations and everything. Yeah, I mean, it would have been interesting to see a substitution or two if that was advantageous in the moment. Say Strother comes on for Poncho, or you move guys around. It would have been interesting to see that, but they didn't do that, and that would make me wonder, what the feeling is regarding depth at the different positions. They have touted the offensive line as being one of the deeper positions on the roster for years, and it's been backed up by the stats, right? Like only 5 sacks all of last season, and then 3 in this game alone against an Idaho team that you're expected to beat by 50. Credit, though, I think is absolutely due to those guys in the front 7 for Idaho. They pretty much played a perfect game. and Oregon absolutely did not reach the bar by way of getting a consistent push and run blocking in the way that they'd like to. Jordan James had almost 100 yards, but it was more a product of his ability in space than consistent run blocking. And Dan even pointed out run blocking is an issue. But those guys on the Idaho's front 7, man, unfortunate that on the other side of the ball that they have an injury with Jack Lane, former Laco quarterback, who is set to miss a few weeks, as you reported. But on that defensive side, I mean, shoot, the rest of their schedule, just as an aside, they could compete pretty darn well in FCS this year.
Yeah, I mean, again, they put forth a valiant effort and good on them, but ultimately, again, like you mentioned, the run blocking specifically, I mean, we could certainly go on and on about penalties and pass pro issues, but and bad as they were, to me, the bigger concern is the run blocking, because that, I mean, you're just pushing forward. I mean,
it's the foundation of their offense too.
Do.
Like they want Jordan James and Noah Whittington, and at some point they didn't use either of them much. I don't even remember seeing Jaden Lamar or Jay Harris. But
Lamar was back at least on kickoff return.
Yeah, exactly. They want to be able to bring in a stable of backs and have reliable run blocking. So that's where it starts. Honestly, that's how Dan Lanning has and Will Stein have sort of built out these offenses. They don't want Gabriel to have to throw 50 passes, especially considering how questionable the pass blocking was. It was tough for him. I mean, you could see, the frustration on his face, not only when Dylan came off the field, but, when we spoke to him in the post game, like it was strenuous was the word that he kept repeating. And it seemed like it felt that way for him, even though he had a strong statistical game, even though really what happened on the field wasn't necessarily his fault, but a product of his protection. You don't want to have that be the case, because he's not always going to, put up those numbers, and you want to be able to throw the ball downfield too. Like they really, for the most part, were relying more on the short passes and the check downs, and allowing guys, like Tez Johnson to utilize their speed and space, which worked out in two major situations, those 2 touchdowns. And then obviously Johnson tying his career high with 12 catches. But they want more, and they want to be able to throw the ball downfield to guys like, Kyler Casper, who had an opportunity and caught a deep ball. Evan Stewart, who was not as involved as some folks might have expected. They'd like to get him downfield, Trayshawn Holden, et cetera. And that's simply not going to happen if they don't improve the protection.
No, it's bottom line. This is, like you say, this has been a strength of the team. The season is still long. It is a brutal initial 1-game sample against an inferior opponent. So in terms of if you're trying to look for optimism at the position group, I understand where fans are certainly going to be concerned. However, let's not completely throw the baby out with the bathwater just yet in terms of, the rest of the season over it by way of the offensive line. But no, it is clearly it was about as bad a performance as they could have had all told, because it wasn't just, like you say, it wasn't just about pass pro, it was about all these other issues as well. So something, obviously, that we will all be monitoring and paying attention to and the like, and seeing how it shakes out, but not just for the rest of this season, but like we're talking about as an area that was a strength for so long, given the lack of substitution. I think it starts, and we talked, again, go back to the spring, we talked about this, of you had to establish and get a clearer picture of what the twos looked like, not only for this year, but because you are expecting to lose multiple players out of the starting lineup after this year, that you had to have answers for next year. Well, right now, and I realize, right now, I think there's a significant portion of the fan base is already ready to call it a day and not even worry about 2024 anymore. Why bother? I mean, they won, but what does it make a difference? Right now, if you had to pencil in the starting lineup of the offensive line for 2025, good luck. Good luck with that. But again, if only we talked about it. I don't know. If it only came up in the spring or something like that. Hey, this was a strength. How and why it may be less deep along that position right now compared to the last several years, myriad reasons. It's not one thing, but the group has certainly weakened, relatively speaking. Now, we got a long way to go for the rest of the season, a whole off season of personnel and player acquisition and the like. But yes, it is not as good an offensive line room as it has been for the last several years. That is a statement of fact. Whether or not this lineup can sort it out, we'll see. To the rest of the game as a whole, particularly on the defensive side, now that we've certainly drilled away on the offense for quite a bit, I'm not going to make more of it than what it was. They did what they were supposed to do in terms of dominating an inferior opponent. And the flea flicker touchdown, which I personally, I can't even totally fault the defense for when the offense is who put them in the bad spot, inside their own territory to begin with. And that's just a brilliant play call in that moment for Idaho's purposes. to come out and do that on that particular play. And then on the other side, they could talk about the screen game and that a couple plays popped and whatever. All right, but on 47 snaps, there were 7 TFLs with 4 sacks, including one that ultimately injured the quarterback, 2 interceptions, and a 4th down stop. I mean, that's a pretty darn good havoc rate, even against an inferior opponent, vastly inferior opponent. Let alone, what the completion percentage was or any which other statistic. Yes, you're going to nitpick about 3 or 4 plays that could have been done better. And I know there's every which individual performance and assignment and all those other things to evaluate. But in terms of overall outcome of the play, Oregon's defense did what it was supposed to do. Frankly, saved the day in any number of ways. The Brandon Johnson interception in the end zone. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if Idaho would have scored there and made it 7-7 relatively early? That was a momentum shifter. Obviously, Reed at the end is just to absolutely put a punctuation on the fact that the game was over. Again, the 4th down stop. The defense did what it was supposed to do. I'm not going to make more about the sack total or TFL total than necessary because they're supposed to. They're supposed to be an effective defense as a whole, and they're playing a team who, no matter how many returning starters Idaho had at its offensive line, none of those players, not a single one, is going to be playing at the next level. So you can't be evaluating whether or not Derek Harmon just completely dominated, in between the A and B gaps against guys who just have no chance, none whatsoever, against a player like that. And they showed it because, yes, he very much did dominate, but he is supposed to dominate against players like that. Against a Boise State offensive line, who is considerably better than that. We'll see this upcoming weekend. But I thought as a whole, like I say, that the defense, the main takeaway to me was simply that the defense caused a high rate of havoc for the number of plays involved. And there were 2 or 3 plays that they can look back on and say, these are the things that have to be corrected, adjusted, what have you. But you have that no matter what. I mean, everybody's got that unless you pitch a shutout. And even then, I'm sure you come up with individual assignments. So I thought defensively as a whole, there really was not much to harp on, or positively or negatively, other than simply that you got some individual production from Harmon, Mateo Iunglele, and certainly Brandon Johnson showing very quickly for anybody who, because they didn't get to hear from him much in the spring, since he wasn't enrolled yet, if they weren't catching up in the summer, if they were vacationing and not paying attention to what the personnel looked like throughout the month of August, the starting nickel is awfully good and is probably going to be one of the most critical pieces of the entire defense. So I think those were kind of the main overarching points of the defense off of this particular game. But you tell me, Ryan, if there was anything else that may have stuck out or may have jumped out to you on what was otherwise, like I say, really just a dominant performance, which was basically expected.
Yeah, I mean, the defense and its performance, in general from this game, like, I think that save for a couple of moments of disorganization, there was a lot to be, positive and a lot to be excited about if you're a Duck fan. With how this group has already come together, you think about, a guy like Brandon Johnson getting that interception in the end zone, and the conversation he and Tez Johnson had before the game where Tez told him, show him why you belong here. Like, that's a pretty cool relationship for those two guys to have. That's a nice nugget of motivation that Tez was able to provide as one of the leaders on this team, on the opposite side of the ball, even. So seeing how this group comes together, and in particular how they react to a Boise State team on Saturday that Dan Lanning himself, and we'll get into this further, has said has the best running back he's seen since he's been at Oregon in Ashton Jeanty, for a guy who absolutely lit it up last week against obviously a not so great opponent, but nonetheless is going to be a challenge for this Oregon defense. I think that they have an opportunity to pass that test given what they showed, particularly in stopping the run against this Idaho team over the weekend. That look, they put in a valiant effort. It was as we said before, something that was that was mostly on Oregon by way of its performance and challenges, but by no means did Idaho come in and fall butt backwards into this result. They absolutely put in a full effort. On the offensive side, I think it is not unexpected, but a welcome sight for Gabriel and Tez Johnson to have this rapport. There was obviously, and Tez even talked about this, a lot of talk about, Tez and Bo Nix had this chemistry because of their familial connection and everything. But I think truly Tez is the most important weapon in this offense. And Gabriel in a pinch, maybe when he was either pressured or needed a check down or needed to find their best playmaker in space, he found him. And, tying a career high even against an opponent like Idaho is a really encouraging sign for the team.
Yeah.
So
for looking ahead to this weekend's matchup with Boise, because again, we're certainly not going to keep droning on and on about Idaho. It was what it was. It was ugly. For those who very much want to jump the shark, hey, nothing we say is going to stop you. But I guarantee you might be paying attention on Saturday night, and either all your angst and anxiety will be rewarded with more, or you may be able to back off the ledge ever so slightly. There are still 11 regular season games to go. Bear in mind, at least. To the matchup with Boise State, and yes, it starts and ends with Jeanty, who, again, coming off the year that he was, this is not exactly a big surprise that he is every bit the elite running back in college football that he is. For Lanning to say, and I agree with him, that he probably is the best running back that they've played in his tenure. For one, it's not an incredibly long list. The Pac-12 was not littered with incredible running backs over the last couple of years. I think the only arguments to be had would be about either Damian Martinez or Zach Charbonnet 2 years ago. And for those who don't immediately recall, Charbonnet did go off for 151 yards against Oregon 2 years ago. So in terms of against the best, those would be the best. And and Charbonnet had an awfully good day, albeit in an Oregon win against UCLA, like I say, 2 years ago. So Jeanty is, forget about the 260, 70 yards that he went off for, I guess, against an inferior opponent. He was a terrific player a year ago. These numbers were absolutely outrageously gaudy. But he did run for, over 1,300 yards last season. I mean, he was a terrific player. It starts and ends with stopping him. You could talk about any which other. It's all about him in this game. If you take him away, Boise State is not winning the football game. If he runs for over 150, you're going to be in a competitive game. And that's really all there is to it. Trying to hold him under 100 is frankly a difficult task in and of itself, but certainly something that is possible. It was done multiple times last year by Mountain West teams. Against Washington last year in their season opener, Washington held them to 44 yards on 10 carries. So it is possible. Can't act like it's something that's beyond the realm of possibility. But he can certainly break a game wide open, and had multiple 200-yard games last year, let alone multiple 100-yard games last year. So he is extremely effective. And it's probably, if he's not the best running back in the country, it's probably either him or Ollie Gordon. It's a pretty short list, and they are Boise State is they are completely behind their guy insofar as they want him to be a Heisman candidate. And when you start the year with 276 yards and 6 touchdowns, that's a nice way to it's a nice way to welcome the rest of the world to the party of, by the way, this guy's really good.
That is certainly a way to insert yourself into the conversation, yes, regardless of opponent. That's video game numbers. And obviously, Oregon's entire defensive game plan, circles around stopping that guy. I would expect there to be an uptick by way of, offensive production for the Ducks, even though that front seven against Boise State is, on paper better than that Idaho front seven, and has some legitimate, as you pointed out when we were, chatting it up in the press box over the weekend, legitimate NFL talent and guys that that can pressure Gabriel, that can make it hard on him as he still finds his groove with his receivers and decides when to run, when not to run, when to roll out, all that stuff as he gets more comfortable in this Oregon offense. But I think that they're due for, given the talent, given the experience on that side of the ball, they're due for a bounce back game. Obviously, it depends on how the offensive line looks. I would be shocked if they aren't sort of whooped into shape a little bit after what is likely to be a grueling week for them by way of practice and in the trenches and criticism in the film room and everything else. I see it as a potential bounce back game, and thereby, if it's close, I think it's a shootout. I think that, Jeanty is the guy that could, be the engine for them to make it a shootout, a high scoring game down the stretch that's close. But, if Oregon's going to win, it does start with stopping Jeanty and with limiting that Boise State offense so that they can, give their offense a chance to be flexing their muscles and say, hey, this is who we really are.
Yeah, to me, yes, it starts with slowing him down, and Oregon's defense still has, particularly on the interior, just the size and strength that flat out that Boise State simply does not play on, forget about a regular basis, really just doesn't face. And they just don't. And there's nobody in the Mountain West who has an interior defensive line with players the size of Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon. Oh, yeah, and then backs them up with Keon Ware-Hudson and Amari Washington. There's nobody on Boise State's schedule who does that. And you just got to call it what it is. So, yeah, he is a terrific player. But running between the tackles in this game is going to be extremely difficult for them because, as I say, they just simply do not play. They don't play defensive lines who are built this way. It's just not something that happens. So you could say, well, you could still go off tackle, obviously. Yeah, yes. But sooner or later, that can be a little bit of a fool's errand unless you get some great blocking downfield or pull blocks and things of the like to try and get numbers that way. But it will be tough sledding in that regard. A challenge for Oregon's defense, no doubt. But conversely, let's not just assume that Boise State's going to be able to churn out the yards that. Forget about that they did against Georgia Southern. That's of no comparison. Talking more about, hey, this is not an infallible situation either. They have an unbelievably talented player. They are playing a defense that is loaded with talent. So let's keep it in some degree of perspective there. Passing game wise, I'm not going to make more or less of Boise's quarterback situation or how much it distributed the ball around to various guys last week. Again, the game is not going to be won or lost there. Ultimately, to me, it's obviously slow down the run game. And then offensively, what Oregon can do there to get everything back in order, starting with protections and the run game. To me, I think there are ways to set a tone in a game as a whole, but also to set a tone to your team in a game. And boy, oh boy, if ever there were a way for Oregon to come out and completely set the tone for a game on Saturday against Boise State, it would be to start with the football and assemble a just absolute possession killing drive with just pounding the rock. That's how you set a tone. And I'm not saying they're going to. I'm not saying that they should. There has to be a way at one point or another in the course of the game, because there were opportunities to do it this past week, and obviously they didn't do it. But there has to be a time and a moment and an instance where you can kind of set the tone and agenda by leaning on the run game heavily when you absolutely have to, for strategic purposes, for clock management purposes, for game management purposes. Yeah, they've got to be able to do that at some point or other, whether it's right out the gate, whether it's in a middle 8 situation, whatever it is, there's got to be times for that. Whether or not they take all these deep shots or not, and again, there are a few fan bases more obsessed with air yards than the Oregon fan base, and I understand why historically that's a thing. But my goodness, if a couple of the passes over the middle that were there for the taking, that did gain some nice yardage, there were probably 4 or 5 plays last week that, including in the run game, that are one block away from game-breaking touchdown kind of plays. All right, you don't get rewards for that, but point is if a 15 or 20-yard pass breaks into a 50 or 60-yard gain and touchdown because the guy got open in open space and pulled away, what does it matter? I mean, air yards, if you're just looking for a video game-esque kind of appearance, all right. I mean, hey, whatever floats your boat, man. But ultimately, I mean, you heard it from Will Stein back during fall camp. I mean, he basically told you, who cares? I mean, it doesn't matter. This doesn't have to be complicated. Go out and be efficient and ultimately score. Yes. Whether or not they take dozens of deep shots throughout the course of a game, and I say, you heard it from Lanning on Monday night. Frankly, it didn't take a genius to see it in real time on Saturday. If you're the other team, who is allowed to play, Idaho too, they are allowed to give forth an effort. What do you think their defensive coordinators, what do you think their game plan was going into the game? Leave a bunch of guys on one-on-one coverage on islands and don't worry about deep throws? Or maybe do everything imaginable not to give up 30 and 40 and 50-yard bombs? Yeah. They did that. And guess what? Boise State may do something similar, or frankly, or may not, because not only do they have a little bit mixed by way of talent, but also scheme, they can throw a lot at you. They can, and they probably will throw quite a bit at. Coverage-wise, we'll see. And that doesn't, and by the way, just because the opponent does those things doesn't mean you have to play into it either. But when it is an inferior opponent, and when you don't want to put a million things on tape, and you don't have to, yeah, you take what's there. You take what's there for the taking. And again, frankly, there were probably 4 or 5 instances where gains of 15 and 20 yards very well could have gone for a whole lot more. It just, you didn't get that one extra block, or you didn't break that one extra tackle, or whatever the case is. And that's going to happen. But we're only belaboring the point in some of it, or fans are only harping on it in some of it, because it didn't happen. The weeks where it does, nobody's going to go back and say, gosh, if only the offense was more explosive after they had 3 50-plus yard plays. No, you're not going to hear it on those. You're not going to hear about how great it was. No, it's just going to be, again, it's in a week of negativity, this is just the latest thing on the list of things to be negative about. But I again, in real time, I didn't think it was an issue. And with the way that Idaho had played it. But for Boise State's purposes, their defense has, particularly in the front seven, I think you're going to know pretty early whether or not this offensive line got its proverbial ducks in a row or not. Because this front seven from Boise State has some real talent. Has multiple players who had double-digit TFLs last year. Has a linebacker who, in Simpson, who Lanning referenced last night, is quite the blitzer, and has the Mountain West, I believe, was co-defensive player of the year last season at defensive end. Who, hey, let's put it this way: I'm not telling you he'd be starting for Oregon over Jordan Birch by any stretch of the imagination. He would not, but he'd be on the 2 deep. They've got a couple of players now. Okay, this is not this is a team who's being picked to win the Mountain West in a landslide and be the G5 team in the playoff for a reason. And it's not just their running back. They have, I believe it was 10 returning starters on defense, even though they allowed a ton of points to Georgia Southern. This team has talent, legitimate talent.
Yeah, and they're projected as in some projections as the opponent for Oregon in the projected playoff, like that potential 5-12 matchup. They could be right back in Eugene at the end of it. A lot of obviously things have to happen and fall certain ways for that to be the case, but I mean this is a legitimate matchup, and without question I think the most challenging of the three non-conference opponents for Oregon. The biggest test coming after what was, like, by all accounts and by their account, a bit of a flop in week one, like against a team that, you know, they had all these expectations coming into the year, and they didn't want to, you know, have to fight tooth and nail for it. We were expecting to see Dante Moore. We were expecting to see all these young guys and get their opportunities. They didn't. Now a quote unquote real game is here. Now one where you are gonna be fighting tooth and nail. You know, unless you have a virtuoso performance and you know, blow them out of the water and show the country, like, hey, we are this team, we are not the team of the Idaho game, and then have some momentum going into that Oregon State game. That's one thing. But I do think this will be competitive. I think this is a Boise State team that will be motivated and honestly smell a little bit of blood in the water with how that Idaho game went. That might add to the edge for guys like, you know, who play at Boise State, and they're like, okay, well, our boys up the road in Idaho were able to compete. What can we do?
It'll certainly. I do think it'll be competitive. Time will tell over the course of the week in terms of, we'll see a little bit from practice as to what player availability may or may not look like, whether Bedford really will be back in the lineup or not, or any number of other factors. But ultimately, I do think it'll be a fairly competitive game. I do, if not outright competitive, because again, I just respect what Boise State has by way of talent, and coaching staff and the like. Again, they're a darn good team. Whether or not they're going to be able to go completely toe to toe with Oregon, and how much Oregon will be able to respond after last week, again, that we'll certainly see. But I do think it'll be a fairly competitive game. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, like you point out, if you're a Ducks fan, hey, what you want is the ultimate in responses, and to completely pull away, and and make it into a boat race, and then say, okay, well, you can come up with every which excuse to write off the initial performance, and now, okay, this is really the team that everybody expected. But if you're in a competitive game, again, that does not mean that this is not a talented team. This is pointing out that, frankly, this game should probably be pretty competitive. Say pretty competitive. Should you be in a 3-point game with 10 minutes to play? I don't know about that. Certainly not last week, and I don't know if that should be the case this week. But should it be a fairly competitive game because Boise State has some talent on the field? Yeah. And given, let's put it this way, given where the issues were last Saturday, and where some of the strengths lie on this Boise State defense in particular, that to me would be the almost the biggest concern. Because conversely, forget about what Oregon's defense did statistically or anything else last week. I don't think there's any translation there. It was a really good run defense a year ago. As we know, statistically speaking, they were very good. However, against winning teams, which I realize gets extremely skewed by Washington, but against winning teams, they did not fare particularly well in run defense. And not for nothing, Dylan Johnson, who had 2 real nice performances against this defense, albeit a whole lot of new players on the defensive line. But far be it for me to point out again, he wasn't exactly a first-round draft pick. Yeah, he was behind an O-line too. Yeah, but Washington, for as terrific as they were on offense, all about the passing game, the run game absolutely chewed up this Oregon defense last season. And it was with a running back who is not the caliber of player of Ashton Jeanty. So this is one of those tests where forget about whether or not they're more talented than a Mountain West team or the like. Oregon will show a lot as a defense, not just as a team, as a defense, and how it handles Jeanty, because one way or another, Boise State's going to have, at the very least, a winning season, if not a playoff caliber season. How you fare against one of the best backs in the country when, as a defense, you had a lot of hollow statistics last year, but when it mattered, you didn't perform that well. This will be a very, very big early indicator of what this run defense is going to be capable of doing this season. Because, look, if you're in a competitive game all the way into the fourth quarter and Jeanty goes off for 150, what do you think you're going to be hearing when Big Ten play arrives? What do you think you're going to be hearing ahead of the October 12th matchup with Ohio State and its running back duo?
Yeah, you're going to be hearing a lot of, can they stop Travion Henderson? Can they, against an Ohio State team that, their offensive line, apples to apples or apples to oranges or whatever you might call it, comparing the two between Boise State and Ohio State, like that, they're tough. And that's going to be a nationally televised and, exciting matchup. So, it goes back to the, you with these early season games, you can make observations and not necessarily conclusions, but it gets closer to the conclusion territory when you're facing a guy like Jeanty and a team like Boise State that's projected to be a potential playoff contender. It can be predictive. It can be an opportunity to reach at least some early season conclusions.
Yeah, because again, like I said, particularly specifically in the run game. For some other things, some other areas, maybe not. It's going to range. It's going to depend. There are still adjustments to be made. The season's still real long. Personnel can change, the like. You can make certain individual conclusions, and you might be able to get, again, really strong unit indicators. Like I say, run defense-wise, this, to me, will be a very, very significant early indicator. Individual player-wise, I'm not going to make a ton out of one game from Idaho, but in case you forgot, yes, Brandon Johnson will be a significant player on this defense. Those are the sorts of conclusions one can make after even one game against an inferior opponent or two games. You can see that even when the opponents are better. For more grandiose conclusions about an entire offense or about a unit like an offensive line after a game where there's struggles, or frankly in a game where they're dominant, you want to get a bigger sample size. And we'll certainly get more into that after this one and next week, up again, following a bigger game such as this one, and ahead of what will be a unusual situation by way of the rivalry's history, with the Oregon State matchup moving all the way up in the calendar, as we know, as a result of realignment and the like. So we'll be chatting about yet a different kind of big game in non-conference play for Oregon next week. But recapping all that does happen this week and the like I say, one way or another, if you're a Ducks fan, either you're going to be rewarded with more angst and anxiety to back up the weekend that was for many of you, from what I understand. Yes, just the absolute. It's been a rough couple of days, so you'll either be rewarded with more of that. So congratulations, or like I say, or you can come off the ledge just a little bit and remember that this team, no matter where they may end up in polls week to week, put that aside. It was a brutal and miserable performance. It was still one game. Until you actually have more to it, you might want to hold on just a second. They do. This is still a really talented football team. I realize, nothing to, not a lot to be thrilled about off of that initial performance. I understand, but still, one game so far. Let's some degree of perspective. But one way or another, we'll be chatting about all that here next week. Reminder: subscribe, like, 5-star review, all those things, so that way more people can check us out. Obviously, send your questions in, as many of you already have, to Ryan for his weekly mailbag. I know that he'll be getting the responses to you accordingly, as he has been now for a couple of weeks. But reminder to send away over there. Remind everybody, Ryan, where best to message, email, and the like for that.
Yeah, R. Clark at Oregonian.com, Clark with an E, obviously, and then Ryan T. Clark on Twitter. I appreciate all the folks on Twitter sending in their questions. They made up the majority of the mailbag this week, though. We need some more emailers, some folks using that old school platform. So any and all questions that you might have, whether it's before the Boise State game, after it, random stuff like somebody asked this week, whether ducks eat fish, and that was, of course, a nod to the Timbers getting a win and over Seattle and gutting the fish. But that's my old following with the soccer side of things. So yeah, R. Clark at Oregonian.com, Ryan T. Clark on Twitter. Any and all mailbag questions.
I was going to say, I'm glad one of us understood that reference, because I had absolutely no idea what you were talking about. So there you go. So fire away with all of your pescatarian questions and anything else for Ryan, and he will opine accordingly. Again, like, subscribe, and like, and we will see you next week.